So we're talking about Imre Nagy and the 56 revolution. And by early November, it had started in October, by early November, the Soviet Union had fully crushed the revolution using tanks. And leadership loyal to Khrushchev emerges, a man by the name of Janos Kadar, once a man who actually been persecuted in the show trials but was allowed to live. One of these people who pledges reform and etc. is rehabilitated. He emerges as the possible new leader. And Imre Nagy has to flee, and he hides it out in the Yugoslavian embassy. And Kadar promises him safe passage and that he'll be released. And Nagy believes this. He's arrested. He's then sent to jail in Romania, and he's later executed. And he was buried in an unmarked grave. And it becomes very important to note this business of graves, because the reburial of Imre Nagy in 1989 marks really the end of the communist era in Hungary. And it shows a commitment to the idea that what happened in between was a time of lies. And I'll explain that again once we get to 89, but keep this burial in mind. So Janos Kadar appears as almost a moderate figure. There's going to be a initial crackdown and arrests of thousands of especially young men, college-aged men who had protested and were arrested. And some will have been killed and will be killed. And at least 100,000 Hungarians flee towards the Austrian border to the west. Many of those people eventually make their way to places like Australia and the United States, where they'll be allowed to emigrate. If you meet Hungarians today, many of them are that generation. And Kadar starts a new style of communism, and he has a phrase that goes with it. He says, "For those who are not against us, are with us." So as long as you're not in opposition, we're gonna assume that you're for us. So this is a kind of moderate version of some famous words that are often used in history. And what this means in Hungary is that they're going to slow down the pace of that industrialization, and they're going to increase consumer goods in Hungary. So we're going to ease the style of living, and we're going to quiet you with more things in the stores and more food and things like this. And we're just gonna have this agreement, this social contract in the society where we're going to take care of you a little bit better, and you'll support this government. And they treat the revolution as this counter-revolutionary force, and this is how it's going to be talked about in textbooks and such. It's a minority of people who are, it's kind of this wave against socialism, etc. That's all going to be thrown out the window in '89 again. That interpretation was lies, and these people weren't criminals who opposed the government and such. And they're even going to make a national holiday about how the revolutions crushes the counter-revolution. And this kind of, again, the ironies that are used, the way that you manipulate history in the Soviet Union and the communist states is always very, very interesting. You take the worst events for your party, this particular revolution, and then make heroes out of it and martyrs. And those people who were in the secret police are going to be martyred for their efforts of defending, communism in Hungary. That's how the first major eruption against this government happens, 56 Hungary. And in the 60s, there's going to be a new economic policies enacted. It's going to be called the new NEM, the New Economic Mechanism. And a lot of Soviet satellite nations are going to look to Hungary and try to find out how they're doing it, because they used to say that Hungary was the happiest barracks in the prison camp, because generally the Hungarians ate better and had better access to consumer goods. High Stalinism basically has fallen away since Stalin's death in 1953. But one nation in particular holds on to it, and the leadership is able to hold on to it for much longer than the rest, and that's in Czechoslovakia. And you read about that in Heda Kovai's work. That's going to last until 1968. High Stalinism doesn't die away with Stalin in Czechoslovakia. The old leadership that was under him, who was very harsh and maintained a tight grip on society, is going to stay in power until 1968. In 1968, we call this the Prague Spring emerges, where democracy, just like in Hungary, is fought for. Young people go to the streets, and there's this feeling that maybe there will be peace, love, and understanding in this area. This time, the Soviet Union does not use its own tanks. It uses the nations surrounding Czechoslovakia. The Hungarians have to send tanks. The Romanians send tanks. The Poles send tanks. The East Germans send tanks. So the neighboring nations that who themselves probably would like more freedom are the leadership is convinced that they have to crush this event internally. And up until really 1989, 1990, Czechoslovakia does not want to forgive the nations that surround them for what happened in 1968, that they were crushed by their neighbors. And if we think of 1968, what's happening around the world, it's a year of tremendous chaos throughout the planet, not just in Eastern Europe. So this is happening in Czechoslovakia, but the focus is not just here. United States is in the middle of the civil rights movement. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be assassinated. In 1968, there are, the beginnings and rumblings of the anti-war movement in the U.S. against the Vietnam War. And the youth movement in America, the hippies and such, is something that is also part of Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. Western culture was able to infiltrate through radio stations and through the easy border in Berlin, and this movement of back to nature, back to some kind of native roots, or in Eastern Europe, and national roots, etc. It becomes popular worldwide in the West, I should say. And France is going to have its own troubles with student riots during this time period. They're going to be fighting for different university curriculum. And even though the Prague Spring is occurring, there's still this appeal of Marxism to academics, really, in the West. Marxism becomes this way of seeing history. We call this Marxist historiography, or Marxist approach. And there's still people who believe that what's happening in the East is really the future, and this is the path we have to follow. And they're against the excesses of the dictatorships or totalitarianism, but they believe that that there's this fair and equal society can emerge. And many historians of that time period would have called themselves Marxist historians, not necessarily for what happened in the Soviet Union. But there's still this grand appeal. That's really not going to really diminish in many ways until the mid-1970s. Prague Spring marks a transition, though, because there's a lot of people still had a lot of hopes and dreams that socialism, as in the East, can work somewhere else. And there's an ideological battle happening throughout the planet, led by the Soviet Union and by the U.S. So they're looking to nations outside of their region in Africa and Asia, and trying to push an agenda of either democracy or socialism. And a lot of money and weapons are going to be flooded into these third world nations. And the United States is embroiled in the Vietnam War at this time period, and there's other battles in terms of funding weapons and insurgent armies around the world from both sides. So 1968, we're still in the middle of the Cold War, and it's a time period of ideological battle. We have youth movements rising throughout the world, and people feel that things are in a state of chaos, really.